This morning, remember last week we concluded our time together in Exodus chapter 4, where Moses was again trying to question what God was doing, how God was sending him out, what the point was, how it would look, how the story would conclude. Would the people listen? And remember, God tells Moses to take the staff, to throw it on the ground, and it would become a snake. And we saw that Moses wasn't a big fan of snakes, apparently, because he ran away. But then God tells Moses to pick up the snake by the tail, and it would turn back into a stick. And we see God, again, displaying his glory and his power over all deities and over all gods that the Egyptians had created. And God is displaying his glory, not just for the sake of Moses, although that's a huge point, because Moses needs his faith shored up. He needs his faith restored so that he can step out and follow what God is leading him to do. He needs this continual pressure to move forward, this continual presence of God to step out. And so we see that's happening in Exodus chapter 4. We see at the end of Exodus chapter 4, Moses begins on the journey with his wife and his children. He gets permission from his father-in-law Jethro to leave, because remember, he was a shepherd, so he had to get permission to leave the sheep behind, to go back on this journey back to Egypt. And if we were to spend a lot of time here, he goes and he says to Jethro, he says, I want to go see if any of my family are still alive. I'm just going to go check on them. He doesn't even tell Jethro the full story. He says, Jethro, I'm just going to go see if my family are still alive here. So even in this moment, he is perhaps demonstrating just a tad bit of a lack of faith again. But he says, I'm just going to go see if they're still alive. And Jethro gives him a blessing to leave. In Exodus chapter 5, in verses 1 and 2. Now remember, we're going to be covering a lot of passages here, so let's stick through this together. In Exodus chapter 5, Moses returns to Pharaoh and did as the Lord told him, and he went to Pharaoh and he said, in verse 1 he says, Moses and Aaron went and said, Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness. But Pharaoh said, Who is the Lord that I shall obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and moreover, I will not let Israel go. This is massively important for what's going to happen during the next 7 chapters in the book of Exodus. Pharaoh says, I do not know the Lord. Moreover, I will not let Israel go. Pharaoh not only responds, but he doesn't let the people go. In verse 6, he says, The same day Pharaoh commanded the taskmasters of the people and their foremen, You shall no longer give the people straw to make bricks as in the past. Let them go and gather straw for themselves, but the number of bricks that they made in the past you shall impose on them. You shall by no means reduce it, for they are idle. Therefore they cry, Let us go and offer sacrifices to our God. Instead, verse 9, Pharaoh says, Let the heavier work be laid on the men, that they may labor at it and pay no regard to lying words. So in the first 2 verses of chapter 5, he says, I don't know your God, and I'm not going to let you go. In verse 6 through 9, he goes to his taskmasters, he goes to his slave drivers. He says, not only are you not to listen to them when they complain and ask to be freed, but you are to impose a heavier burden on them, and you are to remove the straw, the binding agent of the brick making here. So here they are making bricks out of clay and out of mud, and they use straw to bind the bricks together. But he says, you are to impose upon them heavier workloads, heavier burdens. And here what we see is Pharaoh is imposing on God. Pharaoh is continuing to ramp up this battle between God. Remember, we go back to the beginning of the book of Exodus. Remember, this battle is not between man and Pharaoh. It's not between man and the king of Egypt here, but it's between God and Satan. This is a spiritual battle. From the beginning of Exodus 1, God has set himself up here as an enemy of Pharaoh. Pharaoh has decided that he was going to disobey 2 direct commands of God. The command to be fruitful and multiply, and the command to fill the earth. This battle is not about Moses and Pharaoh. This is a battle is between God and the darkness of this world, between God and Satan, who in this case is represented by Pharaoh, who has chosen to set himself up as a god. Perhaps we're here this morning for the first time, or perhaps you think I'm just taking this a little bit too far. far, let us remember the temptation in the garden where Satan comes to Adam and Eve in Genesis chapter 3 in verse 1. He says the serpent was more crafty than any other beast of the field. And he says to them, he says, did God actually say, you shall not eat of any tree in the garden? And the woman said to the serpent, now notice this, he said, did God really say you shall not eat of any tree in the garden? Now, if we remember our Genesis, we know that that's not what God said. He said, you shall not eat of the tree of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. But the serpent is turning the words around here. It says, did God really say that you shall not eat of any tree in the garden? The woman said to the serpent, we may eat of the tree, eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden. But God said, you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it or you die. So here we have the truth being twisted. We have it being twisted. And so Satan comes back and says to the woman, you will not surely die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be open and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. And here in Genesis chapter 2, or chapter 3, we see the beginning of the demise of all mankind. Why? Because the temptation to be like God is the same temptation that we deal with today. The temptation to want to be God. The temptation to set ourselves up as God. So what is happening in Exodus chapter 5, in Exodus chapter 1, and Exodus chapter 2 is the same temptation, the same designation that we find in Genesis chapter 3. You will be like God. You will know good and evil. That is what Satan wanted Adam and Eve to do, to be God. To put themselves on the same playing field as God. Come and follow me, and I will make you be like God. You will be like. The emphasis here is on like God. You will set yourselves up to be like God. Is that not the original temptation? This is the temptation that brought about death. This is the temptation that brought about the fall. And here Pharaoh now has decided that he is going to put himself up, and not only to say, I don't know who your God is, but I'm going to directly disobey your God. I'm going to contradict your God. I'm going to disobey the laws of your God. I'm going to put myself up as a direct enemy of your God and keep you from following your God. I'm not going to allow you to go worship your God. I'm going to kill the children of your God. I'm going to hold them captive in my lands, we see in Exodus chapter 1. And so everything that Pharaoh is doing is putting himself up as an enemy of God and placing himself as a God equal to God. That's all we see happening in between Exodus chapter 1 and Exodus chapter 5. This is the battle that's being waged. It's not just a battle between the king of Egypt over here and the Hebrew people. Because if that was the battle, then surely the Hebrew people were going to lose. They're vastly outnumbered. They're vastly out. They have more weapons. Egypt has more weapons. They have more strength. All of them are controlled by what the Pharaoh decides to do. We see here in the beginning of Exodus chapter 5 that when the Pharaoh decides to inflict on them pain and harm, he just does it. But we know that it's not a battle between men, but it's a battle between God and evil. This is the same temptation we see come to light in the wilderness with Jesus in Matthew chapter 4, verses 8 to 10. He says, the devil took him, being Jesus, to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. And he said to him, all of these I will give you if you fall down and worship me. All of these, all the kingdoms of the world I will give you if you fall down and worship me. And Jesus says, begone, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and you shall serve him only. The battle here is the battle that we all fight. Who is the God of our lives? We come to know very clearly that Pharaoh has set himself up to be God, to be the God of his people, to be the God of his land, to be at battle with the true God. And as we come to this passage this morning, we come to understand that deliverance is not just about freeing people from oppression to the wrongful dictator, but likewise about remembering that we are in constant need of being liberated ourselves. This is relevant to us. We would not be here this morning if we didn't need to know how this affected us. We would be wrong this morning to read this from a historical perspective and believe that this has nothing to do with our lives. Everything in this book of Exodus, teaches us about our Father. Everything here points us to our redemption story. This morning, when we look at the book of Exodus, when we look at what we see in Exodus chapter 5, perhaps what we see in Exodus chapter 10, for us living in the Western world, this is what we need more than anything else. We find the true nature of our hearts. People who are easily enticed to assimilate into the world. People who are tempted by riches. People who are enticed by shiny things. People who are enticed by pleasure. Is this not our story? Is this not what we need? Do we not need to be delivered? Everything Moses is doing is pointing the people back to Jesus, pointing them to the need for redemption. We are pointing to the King. Let us look at the message of Revelation and look onward to the kingdom. The life of Moses is not irrelevant, but rather it is God teaching us, showing us our deliverance for the kingdom, from the kingdom of darkness when it seems that we are being defeated over and over again. Think about this in your life this morning. How often do we feel like the world just keeps beating us down? How often do we turn on the news and then we just quickly turn it off just thinking, oh, it's just another news story. We're just being lost. It's just lost over and over again. How often do we just go down the street and we just think, well, it's just those kids again. It's just those kids are going to be like that. And you probably even say those words, or that's just how our neighbors are going to be. That's just how these people are going to be. And we relegate a society off as just being the society, and we feel like we are being defeated over and over and over again. And we have that defeatism mentality and think it's lost. But then we come to Exodus chapter 6. I'm telling you, we're going to cover these chapters real quick. That's Exodus 5 done. Exodus chapter 6. The Lord said to Moses, "Now you shall see what I will do to Pharaoh, for with a strong hand he will send them out, and with a strong hand he will drive them out of his land." Catch this. Exodus 6:1, the Lord said to Moses, "Now you shall see what I will do to Pharaoh, for with a strong hand I'm going to send them out, and with a strong hand I'm going to drive them out of the land." They've been beaten down. Exodus chapter 5, we see the people of God are being oppressed greater when Moses shows up on the scene. Now, can you imagine this for a moment? In Exodus chapter 2, Moses comes onto the scene. He's been living, at the end of Exodus chapter 2, Exodus chapter 3, Moses has been living in the palace. He has been adopted by Pharaoh's daughter. He's been living in the palace, living in a life of wealth and luxury and eating all he wanted to eat. He's been raised to be a prince and a warrior. And then his eyes are open, we read, and he sees the oppression of his people. He goes out and he kills a taskmaster unjustly. And then he sees two Hebrew people fighting. And so he goes and tries to break up this fight. And then two Hebrew people say, "Well, what are you doing? You're a murderer. Why are you doing this?" And he realized that he is going to be chased and they're going to want to kill him, and so he flees out into the wilderness so that he doesn't get killed by Pharaoh. And so he's gone for 40 years. 40 years he's raised in the palace, and then for 40 years he's out in the wilderness chasing sheep around, and then he comes back into Egypt at the age of 80, almost 83 it says. He comes back into Egypt, and here he shows back up and gives this message of deliverance to the Pharaoh. And then as soon as he starts talking again, things start getting worse for the Hebrew people. And if I were a Hebrew person at this moment, I'd be like, "Okay, Moses, when you were here last time, things got bad. Now you show back up on the scene, and Pharaoh starts treating us bad again. Can you just go back to where you came from?" You know what I'm saying? Can you think about that? You'd be like, "Okay, but every time you're on the scene, life goes bad for us." I mean, that's just what I'm thinking? Maybe you think about it. Every time he shows up, something bad happens. But notice here, it says, God says, I'm going to deliver them with a strong hand. I'm going to send them out. In 1995, there was a movie that came out, and I'm sure most of us saw the movie. It was called Braveheart, right? Anybody here ever watch movies? Okay, so in 1995, now I know that dates me because I saw it when it came out. In 1995, the movie Braveheart came out. And the whole movie is based on the Scottish fight for independence from the King of England, right? They're wanting to be free from unjust rule. They're wanting to be a free people. And so William Wallace here comes onto the scene, and all these people are grumbling, saying we might as well just surrender, because they see the king's armies and droves just marching over the hillside. So they say, well, if we leave now, if we just walk away now, at least we'll have our lives. We won't be a free people, but we'll just walk away with our lives. And if you've seen the movie, you know what scene I'm talking about. They're sitting here talking about, if we just walk away now, we'll at least leave with our lives. And so William Wallace comes up and he gives that epic speech, right? You can remember the speech, and he's sitting there saying, if you fight, you may lose your life, but at least we will have our freedom. Now, there's a lot of blood and gore that happens in the next few scenes, you know what I'm saying? But what happens? They fight, and they almost win. But he rallies the people with this great speech. As we come into Exodus 7, we come to a point where God is demonstrating to his people, regardless of who Pharaoh thinks he is, regardless of the strength of the nation, regardless of their ability to build, regardless of their ability to intimidate, there is one God, there is one king, there is one sovereign to which every knee is going to bow. God says in Exodus chapter 7, verse 1, he says, see, I have made you like a god to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron shall be your prophet. You shall speak all that I commanded you. Your brother Aaron shall tell Pharaoh to let the people of Israel go out of his land. Remember, he's not asking anymore. He's going to tell them to let the people of Israel go out of his land. Verse 3, but I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will not listen to you. Then I will lay my hand on Egypt and bring my host, my people, the children of Israel, out of the land of Egypt by great acts of judgment. Notice here, verse 4, he says, I will bring my people, the children of Israel, out of the land of Egypt by great acts of judgment. The Egyptians, verse 5, the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring out the people of Israel from among them. And verse 6, Moses and Aaron did so. They did just as the Lord commanded them. Now Moses was 80 years old and Aaron was 83 years old when they spoke to Pharaoh. So we come to chapter 7, and a lot is happening here. God is speaking them. God is commanding them. Often these opening verses we can take out of context and say, we see a vengeful God. We see an angry God who's going to speak and harden this heart. And why would we ever want to take these verses out of context? If we read these verses and we read these chapters in context of the whole book of Exodus, we see that God is bringing great acts of judgment. We don't need to ask the question, why else would God do this? God is not evil. God is not out of control. God is bringing great acts of judgment. We cannot forget in this moment that the battle for the heart of Pharaoh is not beginning here in chapter 7. It did not start here. Pharaoh rejected God. Pharaoh set himself up as a god. Pharaoh set himself up in defiance of God. Here in this moment, the hardening of the heart of Pharaoh is a declaration of war. Right? It is literally the beginning of the war. From chapters 5 to 10, we read continually of Pharaoh who is rejecting God outright, even in the presence of the glory of God. The other context we must remember is that salvation comes through judgment. Okay? Let's not miss this point. Salvation comes through judgment. God is going to bring salvation to his people, and he's going to bring salvation to his people through judgment. This is important for all of us to grasp. You know, we think, okay, we're just saved. We're saved by the grace of God, by Christ alone. And so we quite often just want to leave out the judgment part, because if we get Jesus, we don't have to think about the judgments that come later on in Revelation chapter 9. We just get Jesus, so we don't deal with judgment. But we must remember that our salvation comes through judgment. We have to remember that. It is always coming through judgment. How often do we relegate what we know, our relationship, our gospel, to a salvation, our judgment experience? Salvation always comes. We must remember that the only way we receive salvation is through judgment. We do not get to bypass the judgment part. Now, hang with me. In this moment of deliverance, in this moment of demonstrating His glory for the people of Israel, God is demonstrating the gospel. God is teaching us about Himself, teaching us about ourselves, that we are the people condemned under judgment, that salvation comes through judgment, that power that is going to be displayed here is not the acts of an angry, not the acts of a God who is not in control of Himself, but rather God who is displaying perfectly the need for a plan of redemption. Right? We can't go about living our life our own way. We can't go about living our lives completely void of what God has told us to do. We can't go about living our lives completely ignoring the commands and laws of God, thinking that we can do it our way, and at the end, God is just going to wipe it all away. No, our salvation, our being with God comes at a cost. It comes at a cost. We must remember that. It must be seared into our hearts and our minds and our consciences that as we go about our daily lives, as we are not free to be free, we are not giving possessions to possess. We are and we have and we exist and we are given to worship. We are not given this freedom just to be here and exist for the sake of existing, but we are here to be in relationship with God. We go back to Genesis chapter 3, and Satan starts twisting the words of Eve, and she buys into it. Because what is the temptation? Is to be like God. She buys into the temptation of trying to be like God. It is good for the eyes. It is good for taste. And that whole thing, it is what we buy into. It's why else do we sin? Why else do we need a Savior? Why else do we need deliverance? Think about that for a second. Why is anybody ever tempted to cheat on their taxes? It's not just because you hate the government. You know? Why is it that anybody is ever tempted to cheat on their spouse or to lie about anything? Why is it that we're ever tempted to gossip or slander or to look at things on the internet that we're not or should never cross our minds? Why is it that we ever have angry thoughts? It's not because of the goodness of God living inside of us. It was because at some point in our minds, we have placed ourselves as God on our own thrones of our hearts, and we decided we can rationalize it to be okay. How is it that we devise in and of ourselves that it's okay for us to live a certain way while our brothers and sisters literally, now this isn't figuratively, we say, well, Chad, that's just a church term that we use. No, literally our brothers and sisters on the other side of the world who we're going to spend eternity with. Now eternity, and I get it, I'm young. Eternity is a really long time. Like really long. And you say, well, why do you talk so fast? I don't know. It's a really long time. But we sit here and we squander things while our brothers and sisters suffer endlessly. And yet we're going to sit across from them for eternity and we're going to say, what? Well, I got busy. Okay. This is why we need redemption. This is why we need a Savior. But how do we think redemption happens? Do we think that in our Baptist minds that we can gloss over? I mean, we like to think Jesus comes and makes everything white as snow. Well, how do things get to be white as snow? How do things get to be like that? Bruce is going to talk about either the next Sunday or the next Sunday, depending on how long this goes. The Passover is about death. Things don't get made white before they turn red. Judgment has to happen, and we have to remember. Philip Ryken, a preacher, says this. He says, one day God will glorify himself, and he will be glorified in America as he was glorified in Egypt, and he will triumph over every false god in order to prove that he alone is the creator, and that he is the provider, that he is the giver and sustainer of life. And he says, if that happens, or perhaps when that happens, it will show where we have placed our ultimate allegiance. It will show where we have placed our ultimate allegiance. As we look at the rest of this passage this morning, we dive into these signs and wonders. We can step back for a moment and recognize that the significance of what God is doing here is he's doing three main things. And he's doing three main things to point us back to him, to point us back to how he is working. He's, one, demonstrating his glory. He is, two, bringing salvation through judgment. And he is, three, impacting the nation for all generations to come. So he's demonstrating his glory, bringing salvation through judgment, and he's impacting the nations for all generations to come. If you're filling in the blanks, those are your answers. If you're not, you're with me, it's okay. In Exodus chapter 7, in verses 8, he says, the Lord says to Moses and Aaron, when Pharaoh says to you, prove yourselves by working a miracle, then you shall say to Aaron, take your staff and cast it down before the Pharaoh, that it may become a serpent. Why does he do snakes? So Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and did just as the Lord commanded, and Aaron cast his staff before the Pharaoh and his servants, and it became a serpent. Then Pharaoh summoned the wise men and the sorcerers and the magicians of Egypt, and they also did the same by their secret arts, for each man cast down his staff, and they became serpents. But Aaron's staff, catch this. If you're using a Bible, underline this. Verse 12 of chapter 7. But each man cast down his staff, and they became serpents. But Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. That's a showdown. And still Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he would not listen to them as the Lord said. The tone has changed here as we continue in chapter 7. The mood has changed. The moment has obviously changed. We have noted time and time again that Moses seems to continually point out his own inadequacies for his calling to complete the task for which God has set him out for. Yet in this moment, there is no questioning. There is no turning back. Now is the moment. Now is the time when Moses, along with Aaron, are equipped by the power and the might of the Lord to enter into battle for the sake of God. This is the moment that we realize that even in our doubt, even in our inadequacies, the moments that we believe that in our imperfections, our blemishes will keep us from being able to do the work of God. In these opening words of Exodus 7, we witness that God not only calls his children out of their sins, he doesn't just deliver them out of the darkness, he delivers them to mission, as we've been talking about the last few weeks. He not only just delivers them, but he equips them with all that they will need. Catch that. He equips them with everything that they're going to need to do the mission, to do the work. Think about this. How many excuses do we make day in and day out to not be about the people, to not be about doing the mission? We say, well, the Great Commission is for those people who stand up and preach day in and day out. The Great Commission is about somebody else, somebody who's a more eloquent speaker. This person, that person, is not for me. And we say, I just can't do it because I have this or I have that, or, I get tongue-tied, or whatever reason we have. And we say, when God calls people out of darkness, he delivers them to the mission. And not only does he deliver them, but he equips them to do the work. Right? He equips us to do the work. It doesn't matter if we're 10 years old, 12 years old, or knocking on the door 99 years old. He equips them to do the work. Right? Because the work is going to be complete. That's the promise we have in Matthew 24:14. As he's not just calling us to sit around here and play canasta until the end of the days comes, as he's calling us to be about the work of the kingdom. Now, if canasta brings about the gospel, then play canasta till your days are over. But God calls us to go about doing the work of the kingdom, and he equips us along the way. He gives you gifts and passions to be about the work of the mission. Now, how are you using, that's a whole other sermon, but how are you using your works? Because we see in Ephesians, I was about to say evictions, but that wasn't going to work. Ephesians 6:12, he says, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in heavenly places." So he equips us to do battle against the rulers and the princes of darkness. He equips us for that. Like, this is Star Wars type of stuff. Or if you're, like my grandparents say, this is Star Trek type of stuff. You know what I'm saying? The original Star Trek. Like, this is good stuff. He equips us for that work. There's no retiring as a disciple of Christ. There's no stepping back and say, well, I've done my time. It's over. He's like, it's over when you're with me. And then you move up into a different position of worshiping me and being with me continually. There's no retirement age in the kingdom of heaven. He says, I've delivered you from the kingdom of darkness. I've delivered you from your sin. I've delivered you from your life of being away from you to the mission. And not only am I delivering you to the mission, you're not going to walk blindly into the mission, but I'm going to give you what you need to do the work. And I'm going to give you the ability to fight the darkness. Not by your own power, but by a God who, what we see in John 10 and John 12, who is living in and through you. Notice that this staff that Moses and Aaron have here, it's a huge thing. It's a pivotal moment here. For even when Pharaoh says, okay, you can throw your staff on the ground and it become a snake, he calls all of his magicians and all of his sorcerers and he says, y'all do your thing. Right? And if there's a non-believer in the room, this is the place in which you start doubting, okay? This is the point in the sermon where you start saying there's some holes in this message. Okay, this is the point where you start thinking that, okay? Throw your red flags. This is where we start thinking, Pharaoh has called all of his magicians and sorcerers in. He says, you can make a snake, I can make a snake. And I'm like, well, give me a shotgun, I can shoot a snake. Okay. But he says, come do this. And so through sleight of hand, notice that what Moses and what God gives us here is a complete description accurately of what's happening here. They use sleight of hand. And we can look at the historical attempts here. You can paralyze a snake by pinching it at just right place and dropping it on the ground, it comes back. Whatever reason. But they're magicians for a reason. Go to Vegas and watch magicians. They can do stupid things. But even then, God's not intimidated. So what if they can make a snake out of a stick? Watch this. God's snake eats them all. Bam. Now what you going to do? You going to make them come back out? That's God. That's what he's doing. That's how he is acting, even when we feel like we are being defeated. Now think about this. If you've ever dealt with stress in a marriage or a long-term disease or illness, you pray to God over and over again. You think, well, I feel like I'm continually being defeated, even when we feel like we're being defeated, or when we feel like we're making progress in the battle and then we lose ground and Satan jumps back in. We think we're being defeated. God consumes him. Think about the story of Job. Think about the story of Job. Now, if you're not a Bible scholar here, it's fine. I'm not either. Okay? But think about the story of Job here for a moment. He thinks everything, he loses everything, and his friends keep telling him, well, you've obviously done something wrong. And God brings restoration and healing. God literally consumes Satan in the end. When, in the moment of our defeat, we know we have the end of the book. And what happens at the end? He's consumed. The language at the end of the book, he's consumed in the lake of fire. He's not just gone, he's consumed. The message of the snakes being consumed is not just a coincidence. Satan is literally consumed. And for those moments when we feel like we lose ground, or perhaps we're being defeated, or perhaps we're losing the battle, the Bible says that the work of Satan is displayed in all types of counterfeit miracles and signs and wonders. And we see that in 2 Thessalonians 2:9. Satan is a counterfeiter. That's what he does. He's never an innovator. He is like the annoying little brother or the little sibling who never comes up with his own ideas, but is always copying others. This explains why almost every false religion has ethical principles or sacred rituals that even seem vaguely similar to Christianity. Satan is a knockoff artist, unable to make a religion that is truly unique. He is always borrowing something from God. Always borrowing something from God. God, just give me a sign. Isn't that what we say so often? Just give me something. Just show me yourself. Let me know that you're real. Demonstrate yourself to me. We have all done this, right? And then we look at this passage and we say, well, God, why are you giving Pharaoh a sign? In Exodus chapter 7, verse 9, Pharaoh says, prove yourself by working a miracle. Then you shall say to Aaron, take your staff, cast it down before Pharaoh, that it may become a serpent. And we sit here and think, why would God give Pharaoh a sign? This guy who is obviously at war with him. Why? Think about those moments when you're sitting there in the midst of your sorrow or pain or self-pity or wallow, whatever you want to call it, that moment you say, just give me a sign already. Or that moment when you got pulled over by the cop and you say, oh, God, you're not here. You're being an idiot. And we could probably come back thinking, and how does Pharaoh get this? We find the answer in Exodus 10. Flip with me there. Exodus 10, verses 1 and 2. The Lord said to Moses, go into Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the heart of his servants, that I may show these signs of mine among them, that you may tell in the hearing of your son and your grandson how I have dealt harshly with the Egyptians, what signs I have done among them, that you may know that I am the Lord. The message here is the message of demonstrating that God is the Lord, that He is the King, that He will rule and He will reign, that nobody else will compare. At the end, there is only one God. God is writing the narrative of redemption on the hearts, the narrative of redemption to be passed down from generation to generation in the good days, in the days of captivity. This story will stay with the people. God is demonstrating His goodness. God is demonstrating His grace. God is demonstrating His salvation to His people. God is demonstrating His love to His people. God demonstrates His power through judgment. If you look at your handout, we see that there, and I wanted to give you all 10 to look at one time. He turns the Nile into blood. He uses the plague of the frogs, of the gnats, of the flies, the livestock die. There's the boils, the hail, the locusts, the darkness, the death of the firstborn son. If he wants to get a message that's going to be passed down from generation to generation, I think he declares it pretty clearly here. If this were to happen, and there's no other means or modes of entertainment, there's a story that's going to be passed down. This is something that you're going to talk about for generations to come. And you say, well, how do you know? December 7th, 1941. September 11th. I would wager that almost every person in this room knows those dates. Why? Because of catastrophic events happened on those days. And we talk about them. And we talk about them with our children. God demonstrates His power through judgment. He demonstrates His glory through judgment. We don't have time to look at each individual plague this morning, but I do think it's important for us to grasp what is going on here. It's more than just a show of force. It's more than just a demonstration of power. I mean, think about it for a minute. If God wanted to just show off His power, He could have just wiped out the Pharaoh. He could have just thrown down a lightning bolt and said, you're done. He could have just wiped out Pharaoh's whole family and wiped out the dynasty and been done with Egypt. Through lightning or in fire, God could have just used any amount of His authority to demonstrate His power to the Egyptians and likewise to the Israelites. If we think about it, if God had shown up with the fireworks show in Egypt, there probably would have been a lot less grumbling and more quiet walking through the wilderness. right? If we've read Exodus before, we know that as they're on their journey to the promised land, the people just start getting angry, and they start talking about it would be better to be in Egypt. At least we would have had food, or at least we would have had shelter. If God had just shown up with a massive fireworks display at this moment, the people probably would have kept their mouths shut on that journey to the promised land. And when they got there and saw that it was inhabited by people, they probably would have said, okay, we can take this because God is bigger than this. And they probably wouldn't have had to stand around waiting for 40 more years until the whole generation died off. But God does what he does for a purpose. God chooses to do what he does to bring more glory to himself. He chooses to perform these miracles and these signs for the purpose of bringing judgment and for the purpose of demonstrating that his law, catch this, his law is necessary, and his law cannot be broken without consequences. In this first plague, which we see the lifeblood of the people, the Nile is turned into blood, their source of life. The watering, the crops, the fishing is wiped out. But there's a greater act going on here. Keller points out in Exodus 5 to 10, there is an undoing of what we find in Genesis 1 to 2. What's happening in Exodus 5 through 10, the plagues were not simply supernatural. Though, of course, they were. Of course, there was God at work. What they are in nature is nature out of control. Nature breaking down, nature going crazy, nature devouring itself, nature reverting back to creation chaos. Look at that list again. Look at what's happening as we look at this list. The Nile turning to blood, the frogs, the gnats, the flies, livestock dying, ending in darkness and death of the firstborn son. We see nature reverting back into chaos. What we have in Genesis 1 and 2 is we see God takes these elements, takes man, woman, animal, plants, land, water, and weather, and turns them into a beautiful, completely perfect, interdependent, harmonious, completely coherent whole. They are absolutely at one with each other. Everyone works with the other in such perfection that everything is characterized by the beauty and of the flourishing and growth and wholeness of light. Now, in Exodus 5 through 12, we see the opposite. Every day of creation is being undone. What is going on through the plagues is now that you have the weather destroying the animals and the insects destroying the plants, and on and on and on until at the very beginning in Genesis 1-2, where it says the earth was without form and void. The earth is chaotic, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. What God is saying in the plagues is important. It's important to us. Our theology of judgment is God inflicting some type of pain on us, God doing something because we have done wrong. However, what we learn here is judgment is perhaps more aptly defined as the absence of the presence of God. Judgment is defined better as the absence of the presence of God. This is what we see in the plagues. God is removing order. God is removing the beauty of creation, and we find chaos. This is what we see Jesus speak of when he speaks of judgment in Matthew 8:12. Check this. This is Jesus speaking of judgment in Matthew 8:12. He says, while the sons of the kingdom will be thrown into outer darkness, in that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. He says, in outer darkness there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, a place separated from God. This is meant to wake up the world, wake up the Egyptians, wake up the Hebrew people so that they would remember their God, remember who they were created to worship, remember that they're not meant to assimilate into the world, but they are being called out to worship. This is the mission. A few weeks ago when we were studying Exodus 3, Moses was doubting his ability to go and do what God was telling him to do. And during the conversation at the bush, Moses asked God, who do I tell them you are, and what do I tell them your name is? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. God said also to Moses, say this to the people of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and thus, catch this, I am to be remembered for all generations. Perhaps when we were studying Exodus chapter 3, we were wondering, okay, how is that exactly going to play itself out? In chapters 5 through 12, we know how it's going to play itself out. We're going to remember this for all time. We should never forget the plagues. We should never forget this in Exodus 10. He says, I'm doing this so that your children and that your grandchildren hear these stories for all time. So that they know this. 10:2, so they hear and they know that I have dealt harshly. So that I have shown the Egyptians who I am. So that they know. This points the Hebrew people forward to Jesus. As he enters the picture years later, they are still telling the stories of what God has done. And Jesus begins to act not arbitrarily, but it's directly. It's the picture and the purpose of rolling back the plagues. Stick with me as we close this up this morning. When we come to Jesus in the book of Matthew, he goes into the wilderness in Matthew chapter 4 into the temptations. He comes out of the temptations in Matthew chapter 4 and gives a Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5 through 7. And in Matthew chapter 8, he begins to act. He begins to act through doing signs. He begins to act through doing signs. Now, we put this in proper context, and we talk about this on Wednesdays. If you miss out on Wednesdays, you miss out on good stuff. We have really good conversation. We talked about this past Wednesday, actually. He begins to act through doing signs, and his signs aren't arbitrarily chosen. His signs aren't a coincidence. His signs aren't just, well, this happened to happen because this guy just happened to be at the right place at the right time. No, his signs are divinely appointed. In Matthew chapter 8, verse 2, it says, behold, a leper came to him and knelt before him, saying, Lord, if you will, can you make me clean? And Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him. Matthew 8:5, and when he came to Capernaum, a centurion came forward appealing to him, my servant is paralyzed at home, suffering terribly. And verse 14, and when Jesus entered Peter's house, he saw his mother-in-law sick, lying with a fever, and he touched her hand, and the fever left her. These three signs, these three miracles point us to one thing. Remember, these Hebrew people have been telling the stories over and over again throughout generation after generation after generation of what God did during the time of the Egyptians when they were brought out, when they were brought to freedom, so that they would know what God did to demonstrate his power and his glory to bring his people to freedom. For what purpose? So that they would worship him. And here, Jesus brings and speaks great judgment on the people of the Israelite nation. Why? Because he says, I tell you, many will come from the east and the west and recline at the table with Abraham, while the sons of the kingdom will be thrown into outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Why does he say this? Is because they are not demonstrating the faith. Why is he calling them out to judgment? Because they are not remembering the stories. They have not heard. If there's one group of people that after Jesus experiences the temptation, after Jesus gives a Sermon on the Mount, and after Jesus begins to act in Matthew 8, if there's one group of people on the planet who should recognize the king when he begins to walk, when he begins to talk, when he begins to act, it is the Israelite nation who should recognize the King of Kings, and they don't. But here you have three different people. You have the leper who is healed. We see leprosy addressed in the place. We have the centurion who is healed. We have the mother-in-law who is healed from her fever. We have the plagues, the brokenness of the world, the fall that has begun to be undone. Restoration of the fall that is pointing us to the kingdom of heaven. The restoration that is pointing us to the destruction that happened in the time of the Exodus, that is pointing us to the future coming of the kingdom. The warning for us this morning is that have we become so enamored and so assimilated into the world like the Hebrew people have that we're missing the king and the kingdom, that we're missing that when Jesus comes that he is speaking directly to us, that we've had the stories passed down for generations. We have the word of God that we say, where is God that he's not giving us signs and wonders? He's giving us. He has given us the signs and wonders. His miracles only serve to help to prove one thing, to prove that he was the king. And his last miracle that was necessary, that was absolutely necessary for us, was the death on the cross, the judgment, and the resurrection from the dead. That is the only miracle that was necessary for us to know him. It has come. The resurrection is the last miracle we need to confirm the gospel, the truth that Jesus died to save sinners. It is the last one we need to confirm the gospel. And so we sit back this morning, and perhaps you're not a believer this morning, you're a skeptic, and you're saying, well, this is all good and well. This shows just a vengeful God. This backs up my theory that God is just vengeful. You're wrong. This backs up your theory that God is gracious, because salvation comes through judgment. Our judgment, every part of our judgment is taken on that cross. We don't get to bypass judgment. We are judged completely and wholly for the sins that we commit in this life, but our judgment is taken on that cross. And the miracle that we need to know is complete. The miracle that we need to know that God is true is the miracle that Jesus didn't end on the cross. Satan thought he had won the battle. Satan thought that the war was continually going on, but even on that piece of wood, even on that stick, even on that cross, Satan was defeated. We read Exodus 10, and we should not think that this is just a warm fuzzy, that God cared enough to pass a message down, a story for families to share together. No, we should be awakened to the reality that we too are being called to repentance. The message being passed down was a message of repentance, a message to not assimilate into the world, a message to worship, a message to get our hearts in order. This is the message of Revelation chapter 9. Write this down and read it this week. I don't read this to scare you, but I encourage you to read it to keep your hearts alert. He says, and the fifth angel blew his trumpet, and he saw a star fallen from heaven to earth, and he was given the key to the shaft of the bottomless pit. And he opened the shaft of the bottomless pit, and the shaft rose smoke like the smoke of a great furnace, and the sun and the air were darkened, and the smoke from the shaft. Now jump down. And it said, verse 5, and they were allowed to torment them for 5 months, but not to kill them. And their torment was like that, the torment of when a scorpion comes to sting someone. And in those days, people will seek death and not find it, for they will long to die, but will flee. Death will flee from them. In the appearance, the locusts were like horses prepared for battle. On their heads were what looked like crowns of gold. Their faces were like human faces, and their hair was like a woman's hair, and their teeth were like lion's teeth. Revelation chapter 9 points us to a group of people who are experiencing the judgment of God that lines up with the judgment that we see in Exodus. It's not a new story. It's the same story. It's the same message. This isn't a scare you out of hell type of message. This let us be delivered to the mission. Let us be delivered and remember to worship. We must remember that our Savior ultimately did not come to judge us, but rather to bear our judgment. When we see this, this penetrates our mind, when it's seared onto our hearts, when it's seared onto how we live our lives, it transforms us, for we remember who we are called to be with, and how we are created to worship. The plagues. Look at that list this week. See the uncreation that happens and recognize that God is calling us to be with Him. God is passing down a story so that we can be delivered. Let us not tarry waiting for signs, complaining about silence when God has declared His glory for all to see and for all to know. This is the message of the gospel. This is the message of the kingdom. How are we living our lives this morning? How are we living in light of the kingdom of heaven this morning? It's relevant to us. It's relevant to us as a church. This morning, if we believe in the kingdom of heaven and we believe that Christ has redeemed us, then we have a response this morning. Are we assimilating into the world for the sake of the world and for the sake of our comfort? Are we setting ourselves apart, not for the sake of being obnoxious, but for the sake of being called out to worship? And you can say, Chad, I'm good. I got this. No, if we were good and we had this, we wouldn't need a Redeemer who came and died and took our judgment for us. None of us are good. None of us had this. That's why we see in Ephesians 6 that it is a battle against principalities, not of this world. This morning, if you are a skeptic, an unbeliever, someone who thinks that we're just off our rockers, it's okay. That's what skepticism means. But I encourage you to question, to see the God of creation who's called and delivered his people out of darkness for the purpose of knowing and being with him. And you say, well, I don't have the signs and miracles. You're right, you don't. And probably you're not going to get them. Why? Because God has given us them. He's demonstrated them already. We don't need them. The signs and wonders that we need today is to hear him, to be with him, to know him. As we come to this point of conclusion, this point of response, let your heart not be hardened, but let the blood cover you. Redemption comes through blood first.